Hello, and welcome back to episode 4 of the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. Today, we're going to be covering Purdue's trip up to the Northeast to take on Boston College, as well as take a look back at the basketball tournament and the Men of Mackey and how they ended up faring over the weekend. Stay tuned, and let's go ahead and jump on into it. Taking a look at Purdue's trip to Boston College, they're returning their end of the home and home from 2018, where they ended up defeating Boston College with the help of a big game by Rondell Moore as well as the defense. So making the return trip this year on September 26th. Purdue will enter this game having just played a tough game against Air Force, and then they get the pleasure of traveling up again to Boston to take on a Boston College team that is retooling after their head coach, Steve Adazio, ends up leaving. And so they are then dealing with a coaching change as well as the loss of a couple of potential players, star players, but we'll get into that as we go. But looking at Boston College specifically, last season, it seemed like it was, as I mentioned, that was the last straw for former head coach Steve Adazio, who wrapped up his 7th season with the program, finishing exactly 44-44 in his stint with the Eagles. Last season, they finished 6-7 with a loss to Cincinnati in the Birmingham Bowl. And I say loss, but it was more like a decimation, as Cincinnati ended up beating them 38-6. It was a really up and down season for Boston College, as they lost a home game to Kansas, which, after doing a bit of research, was Kansas's first Power 5 road win in 11 years. But they also were able to get a Power 5 road win themselves with a win at Rutgers, which is much less of an impressive stat, being in the Big Ten and knowing Rutgers. So with the departure of Adazio, new head man Jeff Hafley. Hafley is going to be a first-time head coach after serving as the Ohio State co-defensive coordinator last season, as well as spending a bit of time in the NFL as a position coach. Last season for Ohio State, he led a very, very solid Ohio State defense. But as we all know, the transition to head coach can be a bit more of a toss-up, and it'll be impressive to see what he's able to do as the head man. Taking a look at Boston College's schedule for next season, some of the highlights include an opening game against Syracuse. They return to Kansas, and I think it'd be a fun, interesting one, given their results last season. On the 26th, as I mentioned, they welcome Purdue before immediately turning around and having to play Clemson the next week, which I'm sure will be very fun. And then you have your Holy Cross game mixed in there late, and then it just kind of finishes with an ACC slate that includes trips to Florida State, Wake Forest to finish it, and a couple others mixed in there as well. So let's go ahead and not beat around the bush. Let's talk about the offense and some of their more heavy losses from last year. They lose A.J. Dillon, a running back, to the draft after rushing for 1,600 yards last year and finishing his career in Boston College with almost 4,400 yards. That will be definitely their biggest loss, as they were very much a run-first team, meaning that, with a loss of a 1,600-yard back, that step down is going to be big. They also lose their starting QB, Anthony Brown, to the graduate transfer market as he leaves the program for Oregon after throwing for 1,250 yards, 1,250 yards with 9 touchdowns against 2 interceptions. Very solid in touchdowns to interceptions. Yards average to below average, but as I mentioned, that's just because they were very much a run-first team last year, and so he wasn't asked to throw the ball too much. These two players alone will signify pretty major losses on an offense that is apparently looking to retool themselves to be a bit more of a balanced offense going into next year. Taking a look at a handful of individual players and positions, at quarterback, As I mentioned, with the loss of Brown, the quarterback spot is now up for grabs. It seems that it will fall to either the backup for Brown last season, Disney Grossel, or Phil Jerkovich. Jerkovich is a transfer from Notre Dame, who is a former top recruit and should be expected to battle for the starting spot should he be eligible. And Grossel had the advantage of splitting time with Brown last season and actually took over when he was injured midway through the year. In 2019, Grossel threw for about 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns. In the downside, though, that he completed less than 50% of his pass attempts. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye out on who gets the starting job, or even if Jerkovich can get eligible. And if not, then it seems to fall into Grossel's hands just based on experience. Looking at the running back spot, as I mentioned, they lose A.J. Dillon to the draft. But following up should be David Bailey, who was a solid reserve last season for Boston College when Dillon wasn't out there. Last season, Bailey rushed for about 840 yards with 7 touchdowns. So definitely a solid backup, and there shouldn't be too much of a drop-off, at least in terms of congruency. But all in all, losing a guy like A.J. Dillon is never not going to impact you. And so we'll see if Bailey can replicate, at least moderately, the same kind of results. He also will have the pleasure of running behind a good offensive line that returns 3 starters, including, I think, a couple of all ACC team members. So they definitely will have some solid line play, as you would expect from a run-first team, even though they are going to be retooling themselves into a bit more of a balanced offense. Their offensive line will definitely return some continuity and should expect to perform so. Looking at the receiving core, they weren't too involved in the offense last season, as once again they were a run-first team. But it'll be interesting to keep an eye on some names as they look to become more balanced. You have tight end Hunter Long, who's returning after putting up over 500 yards and 2 touchdowns in the tight end spot. They also returned top wide receiver Kobe White, who finished with 29 receptions for 460 yards and a team-high 5 receiving touchdowns. That really is the only 2 names of note that I could see from last season who finished with decent numbers. It'll be interesting to see who else can step up and kind of fill the gaps that they're looking to fill when they try and pass more coming into this season. Head coach Jeff Hafley will definitely have some work to do to implement a more balanced offensive attack, especially with the losses of Brown and Dillon. Looking at the other side of the ball, when Boston College is on defense, their defense last season really did struggle at times. As a unit, they gave up more than 32 points per game. Teams completed, almost 50% of their third downs, which is massive. And as well, they allowed almost 500 yards a game as a defense. They finished the season worst in the ACC in terms of defense. And it shows in routings against when they're in their game against Clemson. They gave up 59, a little more understandable. That's Clemson, but more notably is giving up 48 points to Kansas at home. That is at this point not going to be acceptable for most programs. But the good or bad news is that there is a lot of experience returning in 2020 for this defense. I say good or bad because, the good, it's the same group of guys. The bad, it's the same group of guys who gave up 32 points a game and over 500 yards of offense. Leading the way will be linebacker Max Richardson, who returns after leading the team with 108 tackles last season, as well as 33.5 sacks. Joined inside will be John Lamont, who finished with 78 tackles. He'll join Richardson, locking down the middle. Looking at the secondary, Boston College did finish the season with 10 interceptions as the secondary. The unfortunate part is, or again, fortunate part is that it was spread out across 9 different players. And so it was really it was really a group effort and not necessarily the cause of one star player. So let's see, names to look out for: Mike Palmer, who was a decent corner in 2019, finishing with 76 tackles and 2 interceptions. He finished with the most interceptions, obviously, with 2. So it'll be interesting to see how the secondary looks to improve going into 2020, as well as trying to slow down teams even more. Looking at the line, the big boys up front, the defensive line returns, like most of the defense, a good amount of experience. You have Brandon Barlow and Marcus Valdez, who return to the end positions, as well as TJ Ram at the tackle spot. The experience should pay dividends. Just as as I mentioned, having more experience, I don't think is ever truly a bad thing. The problem is, again, that if that experience isn't coming up with results, then that could be a double-edged sword, as these 3 players only managed to combine for 5 sacks a year ago for a team that really struggled to get pressure on the quarterback. So as I mentioned, they do return a lot of experience, but the issue is that the experience they return wasn't very effective last season, and so they're going to be hoping that this weird offseason can add to a little bit more time of continuity and chemistry, and hopefully trying to being able to generate more success on defense. I can't help but think about how this defense played last year and how this can only be a good thing for Purdue. Purdue is going to be an offense that is going to look to get yards and score points. And so if the Boston College defense struggles to slow down teams as they did last year, I think this is going to be a real advantage to Purdue, especially if they struggle to get pressure on the quarterback again this season. I think as long as whoever lines up under center for Purdue can have time to make the correct read and make the correct throw, I think Purdue will find success against this Boston College defense. Touching on the special teams quickly, another unit that returns most of their pieces. They return their kicker, Aaron Bommery, probably murdering that name, so I apologize. Returns to the kicking duties after going 12 of 18 on field goals last season with a long of 45. This season, obviously, he's going to be looking to be a little bit more consistent. At punter, senior Grant Carlson returns after averaging 42 yards per kick in 2019. And then in the kick return game, they have Travis Levy, who handles both the kickoff and punt return duties. He's been noted for having pretty dangerous speed, and one of those guys who's always capable of breaking free if the kicking team isn't playing sound. So Purdue will definitely need to focus on staying in front of him on special teams plays. So looking at the game outlook as a whole, and it's weird to say this, and I've seen this kind of around other places as well online, that this may be Purdue's easiest non-conference game when it comes to looking at them as a whole. You have a home game against Memphis, who went to the Cotton Bowl last year before losing to Penn State. You have an Air Force team that has been good, as potentially be recovering from some roster turnover, but service academies are always going to be a tough out when they're running this the triple option. And so it's weird to say that this game at Boston College may be their at least most straightforward game of the season in the non-conference. And it's weird to say that, as it is a Power 5 true road game. So even with that, it'll always be a challenge. And I think it really boils down to, and I mentioned this in my written preview, which you can find at boilerinTexas.com, that I think this game really boils down to 2 major questions for Purdue, and I think it is: how well does Boston College make the transition to the new coaching staff and their new system? And 2, how does Purdue come out of their early tough 3-game opening stretch and enter this game? So starting with question 1, how well does BC make the transition to the new coaching staff and new system? This is a program that lost some of their best players as well as their coach from 2019. And I think those can either go very smoothly or they can go very unsmoothly, or very rough is another way to put it. If their transition works out quicker or better than anticipated, I think this game only gets more challenging as it is on the road. But if it doesn't go as smoothly and maybe takes a little longer, the roster turnover seems to be a bit more dramatic. Maybe the offseason and the weird offseason plays a bit more of a role in not being able to build that chemistry early. I think it should go in Purdue's favor in that sense, as this is an early game, week 4. The team may hopefully still be gelling in their new roles and their new system. And in terms of the offense, these are guys that have been, for Boston College, these are guys that have been recruited into a run-first offense and now suddenly going to be asked to become more balanced. And so that can cause issues as well. And so how they adapt to the coaching change and system change, I think is going to be a very big indicator of this game, and I will be able to see that in the first couple of games that they have of the season, and we'll be able to keep an eye on that. As for the second question, how does Purdue come out of their extremely tough 3-game opening stretch? And this could mean a number of things. I'm looking at it in terms of confidence level as well as health. Last season we saw early and often that at any given play, people can get injured and Purdue can lose some major pieces. So how does Purdue come into this game? From a confidence perspective, they'll be coming off of a very, very tough opening game stretch of at Nebraska, home against Memphis, home against Air Force. Those are none of those 3 games are easy Purdue wins, and they're going to have to struggle to find success. And so what happens if they come in at worst case scenario 0-3, dropping a tough one at Nebraska, and then losing against some good Memphis and Air Force teams? Or they come in at 1-2. How is the mentality of this team going to be going on the road for the first time, or not the first time, but going on the road again to Boston College, trying to turn it around? Obviously, in a best case scenario, they're 3-0, or maybe even 2-1. I think that plays a little less of a factor. But if they come in at 0-3 or 1-2, you have to question their mental state and their confidence level going into this game, in which they will definitely need to be playing with a higher level of confidence playing on the road. Then there's also the health aspect. As I mentioned, last year we saw Purdue really struggle with injuries throughout the season, which is why they tended to lean on the younger guys so much, which I think, as everyone says, that will only help Purdue in the long run. But if those young guys, knocking on some wood here, do get banged up early, I think that's only going to cause more issues as Purdue is continually trying to build depth at key positions. And it could if it rears its ugly head again, road trips to Power 5 teams will always be even harder, and it'll just make it harder and harder. So I think this game is really going to come down to one particular side of the ball, and I think it could be said for any of Purdue's games this year, and that's going to be when Purdue has the ball. If Purdue is able to find success on offense, I think it'll be tough for teams to keep up with the skill positions that players that Purdue has. A defensive secondary and defense that is giving up 500 yards a game a year ago all of a sudden has to chase around Rondell Moore and David Bell. I don't like their chances at that. And I believe that Purdue will get more out of the running game this year. And with a defensive front of Boston College that struggled to get pressure on their quarterback, I'm hoping that means our offensive line can take advantage and create some gaps in the run game as well to create a bit more of a balanced attack. And I think like I said, it's truly just going to come down to if Purdue can find success with the ball. I think defense will be pretty straightforward. The Purdue defensive possessions will be pretty straightforward. Boston College is going to be working into a new system, and if they're able to find stops and get pressure on a new quarterback, I think they will find success. As for my official score prediction, you'll have to read my game preview over at BoilerInTexas.com. There you'll find most of these points as well as some others, as well as my official score prediction for this game. Stay tuned, as in a moment we will switch over to the basketball front, as this weekend we had live basketball on TV for the first time, and we will be taking a look at the Men of Mackey and their run in the basketball tournament. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. We are now going to be taking a look at the basketball tournament and Purdue's first run at entering into the basketball tournament with the Men of Mackey. We touched on it a bit last week as they were about to get going. Last weekend, Purdue ended up playing 2 games in the tournament. Again, their opening game against Heartfire, they end up winning, and then they take on the 3-seeded Boeheim's Army, a group of Syracuse alumni. But we'll take them one step at a time. In their first game against Heartfire, Purdue came out, I'm going to do this a lot, and I'm going to apologize now. The Men of Mackey came out hot in the first quarter and ended up leading through the first quarter, and unfortunately they kind of fell off a cliff in terms of production almost throughout the entire rest of the game leading up towards the Elam ending. The Men of Mackey just couldn't seem to get consistent offensive possessions going, and the Heartfire team really caught fire and really warmed up and settled into the game. And all the way up to the point where when we reached the Elam ending portion, the Men of Mackey actually trailed 77-71 before thankfully going on a 14-2 run to finish the game and winning 85-79. That would definitely be thanks to the Washington alumnus and G League veteran Justin Dentman, who ended up scoring 32 points to lead the game as well. Excuse me. He leads the game with 32 points and pulls the Men of Mackey back from the clutches of defeat with a lot of huge threes late and just overall plays throughout the entire game. Isaac Haas ends up scoring the final basket off of a Dentman missed jumper to win it, to push the Boilers to the target score. Isaac Haas finishes with 11 and 10, so posting a double-double. Some other big pieces are Jaquil Taylor late had a couple of big defensive stops, blocks and offensive rebounds and putbacks late to help seal it. So his contribution should not be overlooked, as well as John Octius. I know personally a big favorite graduate transfer of recent memory from me to Purdue. John Octius continues to show his energy and athleticism, and you saw it all over the floor as he routinely was flying around, making plays, and just bringing the energy. This was a tough first-round matchup for the Men of Mackey, and it shows how chemistry and playing with these guys on your team consistently can be a big help. The format, I think, is a lot of fun. Although I will say the target score is fun and it adds an interesting wrinkle. I think the fact that there is a set ending, but there is no set time ending, it adds a different wrinkle. And I think a lot of people have expressed their opinion online that they miss like the buzzer beaters and the big plays down the stretch, which you still get a lot of those. I think it just feels a little less climactic when it's to a final target score rather than the clock hitting 0. But the Men of Mackey end up coming out on top over Heartfire in the first game, which sets up their second game against Boeheim's Army, a group of Syracuse alums that have been playing in this for a long time. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest things this year, as this was Purdue's first entry into the basketball tournament. And I think that kind of shows in the second game more than any that, to have the experience in playing in this and to have the chemistry with the guys that you're playing with the whole COVID-19 situation, it was a very weird run up. And given that it was Purdue's first entry, I think it kind of shows, and they'll get this figured out in the long run, hopefully starting next year. That they had a lot of guys who were initially slated to play, end up with the scheduling changes as well as with the pandemic happening, end up having to lose them and then fill them up with some different guys. And I think that played a big role. So we'll touch on that after this. So let's quickly go through the game. The Men of Mackey ended up losing 76-69 after giving Boeheim's Army a good run. They ended up pulling it within 2 and led late before the Elam ending. So they were able to hold steady, but the experience of Boeheim's Army just too much. Leading the way is John Octius, who filled it up with 12 points, 7 boards, and 3 assists. Isaac Haas also again finishes with 12 and 8. And it's amazing to see how even in more professional sports, how refs just don't know how to call Isaac Haas, who routinely, as we saw in his time at Purdue, was called for many offensive fouls just for the simple fact of being bigger than the other person. And we saw that here as well, especially late when there was a couple of big offensive fouls called against the big man. And it really kind of deflated the team and kind of gave Boeheim's Army a couple of extra possessions that didn't really help. Another big piece to this result was the free throw discrepancy. Boeheim's Army ends up going to the line 32 times, making 28, and the Men of Mackey only managed to reach the line 17 times, making 14. So you double up. That's a 14 extra points that the Syracuse alumni team got just from being fouled. And I think this is a result of just the lack of chemistry and rotations on defense and just kind of being unable to resist fouling. It is what it is. But when you're talking about, losing by 7, when you look at the free throw discrepancy and you saw that Men of Mackey only got to the free throw line 17 times with Boeheim's Army reaching 32 times, I think that's definitely going to be a major factor. And then another one, and this is where I want to kind of also pivot into talking about the original roster additions that end up having to drop out due to either scheduling or the pandemic, is that this team needed more shooting. They end up only going, I think it was 5 of 25 from behind the arc, and that's just not going to get it done. When you're only shooting 20%, you get that up to anywhere near 30%, and this is a much different game. So this is where guys like Ryan Klein, PJ Thompson, Raphael Davis, that's where those guys who were originally slated to play kind of show that would have been really nice to have, especially Ryan Klein coming off of his senior year. Definitely would have been a very nice piece. PJ Thompson, Big Shot Thompson, being opportunistic in his threes also would have been very much appreciated, as well as the energy on both sides of the ball from Raphael Davis would have been huge. There's also Johnny Hill, who was in Columbus before unfortunately testing positive for COVID-19 and therefore being ruled ineligible to play. I think the loss of his energy and familiarity with some of these guys also plays a pretty big role. And so these are things that can be fixed going into next year. I'm not worried in the slightest about the Men of Mackey going forward. I think Grady Eifert is also a name that can't be overlooked. The gritty do-everything former walk-on would have been a great piece to this. It would have filled in a lot of those gaps that would have been left open by these other guys. So, but yeah, going forward, I'm not worried about this team. I think getting other guys involved that are alumnus, and who knows who they talked to, who had interest, who didn't. But I think getting guys like Dakota Mathias, Vince Edwards, and just getting some of these guys who ended up having to leave, Ryan Klein, PJ Thompson, Raphael Davis, I think getting these guys in maybe next year, I think that's going to be a team that really competes and just absolutely has a chance to make a run at it. As I said, who knows who they talked to, who knows who actually had interest. I'm sure this pandemic definitely played a role on who wanted to travel, who wanted to play. And so hopefully next year we're able to put a solid roster together again and hopefully make another run at it. So that's going to wrap up episode 4 for the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our preview at Purdue's football's trip to Boston College, as well as taking a look back at the Men of Mackey trip to Columbus and playing in the basketball tournament. I don't know about you, but I think I can very confidently say that it was very nice to have live sports on again. And I've forgotten how painful and stressful it is to watch Purdue sports live on television, especially Purdue basketball. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. You can find all other episodes to this podcast on most major podcasting sites or on boilerinTexas.com. We have them available there as well. I hope you all have a great week. Come back next week as we at least take a look forward to Purdue's next game on the football schedule. Stay tuned for that, as well as any other topics that may come up as well. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it. I would truly appreciate it, and it really helps me out. But other than that, I hope you guys have a good week. And as always, boiler up, hammer down, hail Purdue.